welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today we're going to be talking about how to draw a groundhog. Like always, I'm drawing using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet, and I'm drawing straight into Photoshop. So, let's get arting. Alright, so here's the groundhog. They have kind of a dark brown up, by their eyes, a little bit of white by them, and then white and some reddish or brownish mixed in on their cheeks down here, with some black by their nose, under their nose, and on their lip. So I'm going to get started with the dark brown. And when we're building up fur, just like always, right, I do two, one stroke, one in between. One stroke in between. And I follow the contour of the face, right? So as I come over to the side of the nose, right up here, it's probably all flat, but right around here, it's going to start twisting. We're going to follow that all the way down to where we've sketched. Same thing over here, right? We're already twisting. Always one in between. And I try to keep my strokes as long as the fur would be. So if it's a short-haired animal, my strokes are pretty short. Typically, the hair by the nose is some of the shortest on an animal. Even on a long-haired animal, sometimes the hair by the nose is pretty short. When we add highlights and shadows, it's gonna adjust that a bit, but because we'll be putting in the full pin pressure, but I'm still keeping my strokes the same length. It creates that nice texture. It makes it look a little bit more realistic. Now they have a pretty wide forehead, so a lot of this is going to be up, but so a lot of this would be coming over and then back down. But yeah, they have white both above and below their eyes. Still angling it a bit because it'll angle in through all of this. Typically by an eye, right, you're going to have hair kind of running right into it and then hair angling down. And I'm just backtracking because their faces are so wide, making sure I'm getting the angle of what I'm doing right. So these should be going up. I started angling them down, that's why I changed what I was doing, because that's not the direction they should be going there. They'll angle up here, typically, and then angle down here. No need for it to be perfectly straight, especially, this is just a color change. No need to worry about that being a perfect changeover. You don't want it to, especially with a color change. There's going to be some blending. Some animals, you have a very distinct line for color changing, but if there's not like a strong line, it's typically a little bit more blended. So, and the beaver is a little bit more, I'm not the beaver, groundhog is a little bit more blended in some spots. Now around the eye, always being careful. So you don't have to be perfectly careful around the edges because it's fur, around the edge of the whole figure or around where there's a color change. But around the eye, we do, simply because, eyes don't have a lot to interfere with them, right? Like, yeah, fur can push in, but that needs to be a conscious choice and make sense depending on the direction of the fur. We pick up those differences. One of the first things we look at as people, as humans, is we look at eyes. And so if we get the eyes a little bit wrong, we're going to notice that. Now there's a little ridge here. I sketched it out, but I must have put it on a different layer. And didn't realize I had erased it out. Right, so this step is I'm still sketching here, right? And it's going to help me when I'm adding full pin pressure to know exactly the direction the line should be going. So all I'm really doing is following the contour of his head, of the direction the fur would likely be going or is going, and that's really what this step is meant to do. So when I add full pen pressure and really start adding in those highlights, all I really have to do is follow the lines I've already drawn. I already have these coming up, so I already know what that is and how that's gonna sit and look, without me having to think about it when I'm adding highlights and shadows, because I want to be mindful with highlights and shadows that I'm highlighting and shadowing right. So I need to have an idea of the figure, any bumps or bulges happening, so that I can add those in as I'm adding the highlights and shadows without having to worry about for direction. Like, it's just one less thing to think about, basically. Because I could, just go ahead and start doing it without doing this step. I like doing this step in the event, just like over here, right? I realized I was twisting my strokes the wrong way. And because I wasn't putting full pen pressure and it was relatively early in the process, I was able to readjust without having to do much to fix it. But if I were putting full pen pressure and really going for it, maybe I would get a little further before I realized I'd messed up and then have to backtrack and put a little bit more work into fixing that. Whereas this way, I know right off the bat I can resolve any line conflicts I might have or fix a direction that I might be going the wrong way. So I find it easier to do this step, but you don't necessarily have to. And I still consider this a sketch, and there are times where I have erased the sketch, where I in the end don't think I needed the sketch, either took away in some way. I don't ever erase it unless it's taking away in some way. It's detracting. Sometimes I will, especially if I'm dealing with black, because I draw black using gray because I'm drawing on a black background, so I can't draw black as black. And because I'm drawing it as gray, when I'm adding highlights and shadows, that's a tricky thing to do. And so I will sometimes erase out a sketch layer so that I can darken up what I've done. Make sure that that black really looks black. So there are times, it's rare that I erase this sort of step, but there are times I do. Either way, I still find it particularly useful in sorting out those details. It's like one extra step. The drawings, you can make a drawing fantastic without a lot of detail, but adding detail can add a lot to a drawing. And this is one of those things that another way to add some good detail here is by having this step underneath. It just adds that little bit more. And in some cases, like some of the details you can add are like adding whiskers on an animal like a cat or something. And beavers, oh gosh, I keep calling this a beaver. Groundhogs, whatever animal I'm drawing, I have whiskers, so I might be doing that as well, adding some onto him. Because that can be a nice, it's interesting that sometimes very small details can make a big difference. And while, a drawing looks great without it, sometimes by pushing it, it looks even better. And you don't realize how good it could look without pushing it just that little bit more. And it's certainly something that I have learned over the years, that by pushing something to pass where maybe I'm comfortable, a great thing can sometimes come from it. Again, being careful with the eye. So yeah, that's, it's whatever you feel the most comfortable doing, really, at the end of the day. Because we all have, it took me years. We all kind of have a style. And it took me years to develop this style. I only started drawing this way, about 4 years ago. But that also means, I've had 4 years to practice it, because that's all drawing is. It's just practice. And, it didn't matter that I've been an artist before. Well, yes, there's a little bit of an easier learning curve there. I still had to learn this style. And I sort of found it by experimenting. You look at what others are doing, and you draw, and you keep experimenting and never stop. Don't be afraid to push something, because I found out a lot of great things and stumbled on a lot of really interesting techniques by experimenting. I learned on traditional media, like colored pencil, pen, things like that. And I will say that I think it is easier for me to experiment with digital art, right? Like I'm much more willing to experiment with something than I was now than I was when I was working on paper with pen or colored pencil, because if I make a mistake, or if I know I'm about to experiment, I can just put it on a new layer, right? Put it on a new layer, I make a mistake, it doesn't work out, and I just delete the layer, and I've lost nothing. Whereas on, if I experiment using pen, well, I can't really erase the pen. So if it doesn't work out, I'm sort of stuck with it. So I will say that I've noticed that for one, digital art is the perfect medium for me. When I discovered it, it was like everything in my art life changed. And I absolutely love it. But it also, the extra benefit is it lets me have that freedom to experiment without feeling like I'm going to mess something up. I wish when I was still working in a traditional medium that I hadn't been so nervous about messing it up and losing all the hard work. But because I still think that's important, and you can do it with traditional media. It was just never something I was able to do. All right, now we're going to switch to this lighter color, to the white, for the groundhog. I feel like I need to chant to myself what I'm doing. Poor little guy. He's got the big buck teeth. I think that's why I keep calling him a beaver. But he's not. He's a groundhog. Now, as I'm adding in a new color, I'm weaving it together with the old, right? Like I'm still putting these strokes in between the others. And as we blend it in, I'll be overlapping more of these colors. So first I'm going to get it all sketched. And then once we add the highlights and shadows, kind of after that point, I will start, I'll probably do it a little bit then, but I need to make sure as like a final step that it's blended nicely. So as I'm building up the fur off of the chin, coming straight down in the middle and then angling it as I come to the side, or angling it to the left or angling it to the right. And you can see I'm really angling it now as we come further over. Helps avoid line conflicts and is traditional to likely how the fur on the animal would be going, or accurate to how the fur on the animal would be going. Sometimes I do this where I don't fully sketch in everything, so I don't have the nose, the little bit of black under the nose, and then the lip and the teeth, or the rest of the ear sketched in. We'll get to that after we add the highlights to the groundhog, not beaver. So I'm going to have the light source coming from above and to the right. Like always, right, that's above and in front of, not behind or next to. It's the best possible way, right? You want your subject to really be illuminated in the best possible way, and so you want a light source kind of in the front, particularly on faces, but since I'm drawing a portrait anyway, you want it from in front, not from behind or next to. You're not going to get as much light that way. As I do this, I'm going to put full pen pressure, and all of the edges are in shadow, even on the side of the light source. The figure is rounding, right? And so with the light source above and in front of, it's hitting, but this is already rounding away, and we would see that, so this edge is going to be in shadow. Not a lot, not nearly as much as the other side, but certainly just a little bit because it's rounding away. But we're going to start over here by the nose, work our way out. And again, full pen pressure, really layering up the lines and just following the contour we did in that previous step, right? So I've already sketched this out. I've already sketched this direction out. So I don't have to worry about figuring that out. I know that that's already sorted. And so I'm just gonna fill it in. All I have to worry about now is making sure I'm mindful of my light source. And that's important when you're drawing, staying consistent to your light source. So I'm always thinking about what's in the way, right? As we come over here, you're going to start hitting some shadows because you have, you know, the shape of the face that would be blocking some of that light coming in. As his little muzzle sort of sticks out. Nose won't block a ton, like right against here, you know, against his lip. Still is probably going to have a little bit of light, but then it's going to round away because it's rounding back into the face. So, you know, the actual muzzle itself will be blocking some light. Likely some burst of light under the eye here. That's what I usually do. Even if you wouldn't see it, I find it's an effective way to sort of indicate to us, you know, give more interest towards the eye. It looks more right. Sometimes, you know, we want to draw what we see, but sometimes what we're doing is we're translating a three-dimensional object onto a two-dimensional plane. And in that translation, some information is different. And sometimes I find that you can make an artistic decision that wouldn't necessarily be 100% correct, but it would look wrong without it, and or it'll look better by doing it. In which case it's probably a good decision to do, even if you don't technically see it. I've noticed that before. You know, when I would go to college, you would draw people, and if you draw it from the side or something, the light, maybe you couldn't see where the jaw was, but if you didn't actually draw that in, it wouldn't look right. And so I learned pretty early on that sometimes you have to make some artistic choices that aren't 100% reality in order for something to look correct, because again, we are translating. That's why sometimes it's easier to work from photographs, is the camera, the photograph itself, it's already translated onto a two-dimensional plane for us. But if you're drawing a live object, you have to do that translation yourself. And there are some differences there. Some things that don't necessarily translate as nice and neat as one might think. Blending in a bit with the color, with that white. Still probably going to have some blending that happens with the white after, but we'll see. If I blend it well enough while I'm drawing it, maybe I have to do less, but either way, it's easy enough to pull and really blend in colors together even after the fact. I'm just putting that full pin pressure in. And then somewhere over here, it's going to start transitioning into shadow. So that's another thing to sort out. Usually not right through here yet. You know, some of that fur direction that I drew is going to help me determine that, because you have the fur coming this way, which still kind of indicates it's a little bit flatter before it dips down, right? So I'm inclined to say that all of this brown would be in highlight, even as it comes down next to the nose. Now sometimes right up in here, there's going to be a little bit of shadowing on this side, whereas the opposite's true on this side, right? Light source coming from over here. There's a bulge where the eye is. Sometimes I don't draw that in. I've found that you don't necessarily need to, but it does add extra interest. So I do leave that up to you. I'm going to draw it this time to sort of show how I would do it. Right, also right under the eye, you're going to have some shadowing. But because this is angled down, I'm going to kick that right back up. It's going to be more up in here because light source from this side, right? So fur dipping in on this side, right underneath, and on this side, you're going to have a burst of highlight. But probably a little bit of shadowing right through here where the eye dips down before it kicks right back into highlight. It's not much. And when I do shadows, all I do is hold back my pin pressure, right? That's all I did there. And then I'm going to sort of fade it back into highlight. So I don't want a hard transition there. Just kind of this little bit of shadow. An awkward angle for me to draw. And again, over here, creating that shadow against the face, or against the edge. All I'm doing is holding back my pin pressure, sort of very lightly, pulling these lines up, following that contour. And then as I build it back in, I don't want a harsh line. Like I don't want somebody to be able to look at that and be like, ah, yes, this line right here, this is the shadow versus the highlight. So I have to make sure it's nice and sort of feathered in. So as I bring this back to connect with it, right, sometimes I'll feather it from the shadow instead of bringing the highlight all the way in directly. So like from here is where I'll start building that connection back out. I'm putting a little bit more pin pressure here than I was. That gives me more room to pull the highlight, the full pin pressure in without creating a harsh line. And then right against the eye on this side, a little bit of shadowing, turned away from the light source. And then right back into highlight before going right back into shadow. Right against this eye over here, on the inside, you have that light source coming in, from the right. So there's going to be some shadowing on the tips of the fur on this side. However, that dip where we shadow just that little bit over here would be in highlight because it's turning towards the light source, right? So all of this is in highlight. All the way up to an eye, all the way up to the eye is always a good bet when you're trying to figure out where to cut the highlights and shadows off, where to transition that. Always bring it over to the eye. But even still, you can see this dip happening. So this is going to be in shadow. So I'm going to do a good portion of this side in shadow, but there's going to be more shadowing than I need because there's going to be a transition point, and it's going to be easier for me to do that in shadow. Of course, all of this is still in highlight. So we're just going to bring that down and connect it all in before I start letting off my pin pressure and tapering that out. So I think this is going to be in highlight, so we'll bring this down a bit, probably transitioning through here, but I'm going to go ahead and solidly connect this to the other because I don't want there to be a weird gap there. The rest of this I'm going to go ahead and do in shadow, so I'm just going to do those light pin strokes, not a lot of pin pressure, thinner, lighter, fewer strokes, and then blend it to a nice smooth transition from highlight to shadow. Same is true up here, right? There's going to be a little bit of a transition to happen. So the forehead, I know I've mentioned this before, but the forehead often has more highlight than anywhere else on a face, partly because there's nothing to obstruct it. It's typically just forehead, right? Like it doesn't have a nose or eyes or different sections that sort of bulge and bump out. Now that's not always the case. When I did the English Bulldog, that certainly had a lot of wrinkles, but the forehead's typically, because it's the closest to the light source, if you think of every object like a ball, and how would light be hitting that ball? The forehead is the most ball-like feature. And so all of that close to the light source is going to be in highlight till you get to the back and the bottom edge. But, as you come underneath, you come down that ball, underneath in that backside, really kick in a lot of shadow. So that's all doing this is just like, you're highlighting and shadowing a very complex ball that, has eyes and noses and mouths and things like that. So, but I find it easier to think of it in those terms, right? Like, that it's all shapes, and how are the shapes interacting and playing with other shapes to create the shadows and highlights in whatever pattern we end up with. All right. So now we're going to sort of feather it in, right? And so by that I mean I don't have to put full pin pressure when I'm drawing into a section that I've shadowed like this. What I'm going to do is layer up the lines so that it's the amount of lines that are now changing this from highlight to shadow. Making sure that this is a nice, easy, seamless transition from highlight to shadow. We'll have to do the same thing with the white. And then down in here as well. Making sure this is a nice, easy, seamless transition from highlight to shadow. Just by laying right up the lines. You don't want a harsh transition. You want it to look nice and subtle. Sometimes you have to go deeper into it than you think. I'm also going to give a little burst under the eye here. And then I'm going to transition this in as well. The white will have some highlighting as well, so that's why I'm doing the brown underneath the white, to allow that to sort of fade in. Okay. Now, on to the white. Same thing, full pin pressure. Done some blending in with the brown, but I'm probably going to blend in more than just that. The white's the lighter of the two colors, so it's the easiest to put over top of the brown. Whenever you're blending colors together, taking the lighter of the two and pushing it into the barrier for the other is a little bit more effective than taking a dark and trying to do it the other way. So we'll be able to see that lighter color on the darker color. See what I mean by going up in here, right? Like if I take this over top of this brown, you can tell there's some blending happening. It's not like this hard line because I'm drawing into the brown now. So if ever I want to, feather it out, it's just a matter of pulling these lines further into this brown here. And when I draw, I know that sometimes I do this more than others, but sometimes I'm a little bit all over the place. Especially in an animal kind of like this, where there's a whole lot of space and not a lot of extra interest. Sometimes I'm a little bit more bouncy from spot to spot. It just helps, I don't know, break up the space, break up what I'm doing. Doesn't seem as daunting that way. Okay, so we had a little bit of shadowing right in here, right? We're going to do the same with the white and connect that in. A little bit of shadowing in here, but we already have, like where this is rounding back, that's going to be catching the light source because we have this sort of rounding back of the way the fur's coming up following the eye around. So really making sure that when we're sketching this out, we're sketching it in a way that makes sense for that. And then blending it back together. And it's not for the whole thing, because some of this is just a matter of the fur, kind of, I don't know how to explain it, reconciling itself as it comes back down. So I'm going to push this up into the brown, make the transition not as harsh everywhere. There's an edge with the brown, just pulling it into the brown, pulling the white into the brown. Now, typically as the lips come over, if there's a dip here, which usually there is, you know, one side's going to be in shadow because you have that dip going away from the highlight, and that's the side of the light source, right? It's dipping down. Then you're going to have the opposite side that's going to be in highlight because it's coming back out of that recess. And then of course the bottom here, you know, this would be in shadow because you have the bottom of the mouth, and that would be definitively turning away from the light source. Right, so all of this. You have this little section, and then right back into highlight. I need to make sure while I'm doing this that the highlight and shadow change doesn't change with the color, right? I mean, it would be changing over before then, and if you do it with the color, it can make it look a little off. So I'm mimicking, you know, this side's in highlight, this side's in shadow, and then in between we'll be picking that up in highlight and then blending that in, bringing that up. Right, so this obviously in highlight because you have that hump coming over, transitioning over into shadow. Right, and this backside in shadow. And then, you know, a little bit on this side is going to have some highlight. So just like before, it's not that I'm putting more pin pressure, it's that I'm putting more lines into an area like this. Nose wouldn't be big enough to block, really. So it's going to be in highlight until it rounds kind of away. I'm going to do the whole bottom lip in shadow first, and then work out the highlights from there. I sometimes find that easier, especially when you're dealing with a tighter space, because you want to feather it in, right? Like, you know, the cheeks and stuff, this is such a big amount of space that it'd be relatively easy to, you know, if I brought the shadow up higher on this side, I could easily have more room to maneuver and feather in the highlight. But when you're dealing with less space, there's not a lot of room to do that. So sometimes, well, sometimes, every time I'm drawing in the bottom lip, I typically do it this way, just very lightly at first. And then from there, sort it out. But anytime I'm dealing with a tight space, just like I did on this backside, right? Just a little easier to sort it out when on first glance I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to cut it, because you can, you know, I know it's going to be right around here, but this will give me room to feather it in as I come over, while making sure that I feather it in on the bottom. Top is running into the lip, so that's probably going to be in a nice good highlight, as opposed to typical when animals are, you know, when I'm doing this, this is the top of the mouth, and that's not really true here. So, right, like this will be in highlight. Make sure that that bottom section goes into shadow. Be highlight all up in here. Again, not putting, I mean, I'm not holding back like I was, right? I am putting a little bit more pin pressure, but I'm not putting full pin pressure like I was over here. I don't need to. Can layer up more lines. Have that fade though, so I'm not going to bring this all the way over, because it's going to be kind of blocked by this lip here as the fur kind of runs together. Making sure this is nice and bright. and then bringing it over, right? This would be the hump in the lip, and then we start fading it out. But we have a long way to go to fade it. Now we're going to do the black. And the black, because I draw in black, as I mentioned earlier, I do black as gray, and it's just a matter of putting less lines and pin pressure and stuff. So first, I'm going to get all the black sketched in. Right, as I bring the lines over for the nose, I'm sort of, angling it to the right, bringing them towards the nostril, and then sort of looping that under. But I don't have to limit how long these strokes are because there's no, fur length with a nose. It's just a nose. And likewise on this side, as I go over towards the left, I'm looping it towards the left. Keeping it a little looped as I bring it under, right? So this is the bottom of the nose. With the fur, we'll be doing it more like, like the other fur we did when we get into that section. But the lip will be more like the nose. And then under here, having this sort of come down and around. And we have the fur under here. Kind of a big space, right? They have a big gap between their noses and their mouths. I'll have to, move around the teeth. Again, just very light, stopping where the sketch of the teeth are. Now the teeth will be kind of an off-white. It's hard with black to do this. I often try to let black stand on its own, but can't always. So I'm not putting full pin pressure. Just sort of lightly filling in the lines here. Light pin pressure. As I come over to the shadowed side, I'm going to be more mindful about sparsing the lines out so that it leaves me some room to be able to add highlights on, this side that I'm currently doing. Because otherwise there's not a lot of, it won't be that easy. Get the nose under here. They often kind of loop like this. You see it a lot with like dogs' noses and stuff. So just a little bit of, still not full pin pressure, still keeping my lines a bit sparse, but obviously by adding more it's going to thicken it up, or brighten it up I should say. And then fade it out as we come over. And underneath as well. So some of the reasons I back out, right, like it gives me a better overall view. So from this backed out angle, I can see mistakes where maybe being zoomed in I couldn't. Particularly in how it's faded right here. I don't think it's blended as nicely as it could be. But when I'm zoomed in, I might miss some of those details. This gives me a chance to say, I gotta fix this or that. And see, now I can back out and it looks a lot smoother. Same thing for the fur. A little harder because this angle is not a good angle for me to draw. A little bit of a highlight. Going to finish out the ears, and then we'll do the teeth, and then the eyes. But first are the ears. Right, so this backside here would be in shadow. Right over here. It's away from the light source, which is over here and in front of. But I'm going to do this little strip in shadow to give myself some wiggle room. But it wouldn't all be in shadow. This section be in the brown. but there'll be white hair coming up through it. All right. With some highlight. And then fading it off into shadow. Give a little bit more of a burst to the inside of his ear here. But I still want to make sure it's clear it's the inside of his ear. A little bit more shadowed. Alright, same thing on this side. Now as opposed to the other side, right, where we had shadow on this side with the highlight, this one's going to have that nice highlight hitting on that back side, except of course all edges are in shadow. So just filling that in. So you have that light source that'd be hitting directly on it. And then it would be fading out as it comes to this front side, or to this, inner edge. And of course this top back would be. Opposed to the other side, don't think any of that interior ear would have that burst of light that we gave to this one. Okay, so now we're going to add some hair on that interior section of the ear, right? It's just some messy fluff. Gonna lightly do it, and then both sides are gonna have a little bit of highlight on this hair. I'm gonna put this on a different layer. And then we're gonna add some highlights. We don't want it to be overwhelming, but just some quick wispy lines. You want them in different directions. You want this to kind of look chaotic and messy because it's long, wispy hair going into shadow as it comes into the face. And then on this side, same thing, except it's not going to be near the tips or the bottom because it's going into shadow, but kind of in the middle. I have some wispier hair here in the middle. Now for the teeth, I'm gonna make it a little bit less white. Okay. And they're just gonna come right straight down. Both of them straight down. Lightly fill it in before we add the shadows and highlights. Or I should say, I guess I'm adding the shadows now. Lightly fill it in before I add the highlights in, really. Leave it a little bit more sparse towards the top, because that's where, it's going back into the face. It would have a little bit more shadow to it. So now we need the highlights. They're down far enough you would get some highlighting, right? So right down in here, we don't want it too. And what I'm gonna do is follow this line of the lip up, leaving, this gap. And then on this side, same thing. Following that line of the lip down. Even doing that, I think added quite a lot. I'm just debating on what to do for the eyes. They're pretty dark, like a lot of smaller animals. Just feel like I could draw something in, but for now, let's see what this looks like. So I'm gonna just take the select tool and create the light flare on the eye without drawing it in. Scratch that. I'm gonna try and do a brown eye. Most animals have brown eyes. Groundhogs are described as having black eyes, depending on who you read. So their eyes are probably pretty dark. With this brown and just... So right, lightly filling it in. I don't fill in all the way around. I leave the top dark because that'll be, you know, where the shadow's kicking in. Typically. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I fill it in, especially if there's too much space left. Fill it all the way around. Same thing on this side. Then I always take this elliptical marquee tool and I just make sure I've done their eyes justice. Set it away, and I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Yeah. Okay. Light source coming from above and to the right. So, first thing I'm going to do is add a burst of light against the pupil opposite of the light source. Pupils are recess in our eyes, right? So as that void is coming back out, it's going to catch the light, whereas on the side of the light source, it's going to go into a shadow on that edge, and then of course the actual highlight for the eye on the side of the light source going all the way underneath, but the edge will be in shadow. So we all have that little dark section around our eyes, and the eye itself will be going into the recess of the head. Right, so all under here, highlight. Going into shadow on this side. Make sure that highlight's nice and bright. It's really catching the light here. And then just make sure that it also is faded out nicely. And then I fade it out on this side, this upper edge, before it gets to the edge itself. Alright, there's one side. Same thing on this one, right? Burst of light against the pupil, going underneath, and then highlight on the side of the light source, and then underneath the eye. So then the last thing for the eyes is the light flare. It's one of the most important parts. I'm going to take the elliptical marquee tool again, make a little circle in the highlighted section of the eye, so I don't want it up in the shadow. And then on the side of the light source, and then I'm just going to fill it with the foreground color, which I already changed to the white, and then drag it over and do the same thing on this side. I usually start with the eye that's in more shadow, because typically there's less room to work with, especially on eyes that are small. Back out, see if that looks good. It does. I'm just going to give them both a little nudge higher. Yeah. And then I did already mention it, but they do have whiskers. We're going to make them gray because their whiskers are black. And then just lightly, not full pin pressure, but lightly coming off their face. You want them kind of bunched up, moving my arm at the shoulder. You don't want one by itself, right? Like you want to have several. And then whatever you do on one side, you need to do on the other. So same thing, I have some coming down, some coming out, some coming all the way up to here. Starting kind of by the nose, right? So starting in this sort of whisker section and then building them up like we did on the other side. And I decided to do one more thing. which I already put the layer underneath the whisker layer, and that is to mess up some of the white fur. And when I'm talking about that is, I mean, I'm like pulling some of this hair off and around, right? Like I'm light pin pressure, but messing up the fur a bit so it looks like it comes off a little longer, a little more unkempt. So they certainly have it, especially down by their mouths, on the chin, particularly a lot of it. Just, you know, more detail. Again, not full pin pressure. And pulling it all the way over. Different directions, light strokes, just enough. Give him a messier muzzle. It can add to the effect of like longer hair or messier hair. And then I'm gonna do it to the brown as well. Otherwise it'll look out of place. Same thing, same motions. They have that kind of, they have kind of thick hair. Their hair kind of pushes up past their, you know, the edge of their body. That's how thick it is. And then it just occurred to me that they have this like, some places in their white fur they have some brown poking in, so I'm just going to add a few spots where some brown seems to be poking up. Just going to draw it on the white. Nothing too overwhelming. Just in a few spots where, you know, maybe some brown's coming through. Alright, so that is how you draw a groundhog. I hope that was helpful. In the floating nether next to me I have other videos of art tutorials I have done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.